Hola, ¿qué tal? Welcome back to Spanish Lessons with Professor Jason. This video lesson is going to be a follow-up on my previous or initial lesson on the use of relative clauses and relative pronouns in Spanish. Now, if you haven't seen that first video yet, I do recommend that you go watch it, especially if you're not sure what relative clauses and relative pronouns are and how they work. However, if your time's limited and or you have a quiz on the use of relative pronouns coming up within the next few hours, this shorter version might be just the thing. Now, I mentioned in that initial video lesson that the most versatile and frequently used relative pronoun in Spanish is in fact que. So in this more streamlined lesson, I want to focus on the prominence of que as opposed to other options and present simplified rules for when it can and cannot be used, and when we have to resort to other forms, most notably quien or quienes. So basically, to sum up my approach in this video, I'm going to try to teach you the you can always use que unless method. Let's get started. Alright, so first let me present what I believe to be the most technically accurate you can always use que unless rule and exceptions along with some examples. There are really two parts to this rule. Okay, here's part A. You can always use the relative pronoun que unless, and this is the first part, the antecedent is a person and the relative pronoun is preceded by a preposition other than con or de. So in these cases, in such cases, use quien or quienes. In other words, if the relative clause is introduced by a preposition other than con or de, and it's a person, use quien or quienes. Or you can use a compound form such as el cual or el que, los cuales, etc. in more formal speech or writing. Some examples. We could say, Ana es la novia con que siempre soñaba. That's acceptable. Why is that? Well, if you look at the rule, and you might have to slow down and pause here, after the preposition con, que is all right. Or we could use quien. Ana es la novia con quien siempre soñaba. To me, that sounds better than con que. Ana es la mujer por quien renunciaré a la soltería. Why am I using quien? Because I have a person and I need a preposition. I'm using a preposition other than con or de. Then I can only use quien or quienes or one of the long forms. Another variation of this. Ella es la mujer al lado de quien quiero pasar el resto de mi vida. Okay? Couple more examples. Él es el candidato de que conversamos. Now, why is this acceptable? Again, even if I'm talking about a person, and even if I have a preposition, if that preposition is con or de, I can use que. So again, the first example on the page, Ana es la novia con que, or this next one, él es el candidato de que conversamos. Or I could use quien. Él es el candidato de quien conversamos, which to me sounds better. If I have a different preposition other than con or de, I cannot use que. Él es el candidato contra quien luchamos, against whom we struggled or we opposed. Enrique es el candidato al lado de quien lucharemos. Okay, now the second part, sort of the second contingency to this always use the relative pronoun que unless approach is we can always use the relative pronoun que unless the antecedent is a thing and the relative pronoun is preceded by a preposition other than a, con, de, or en. In other words, if the relative or if the antecedent is a thing and the preposition introducing that thing, either there is no preposition or the preposition used is a, con, de, or en, a one-syllable preposition, we can simply use que. However, if we're talking about things and some other preposition other than a one-syllable preposition like these listed is being used, then we need to use either the el cual, la cual, los cuales, el que, la que, los que, etc. compound forms, as the examples illustrate. So the first example in each group shows the use of que with a one-syllable preposition. La película de que te hablé ya no está en el cine, which is acceptable. Or I could use a long form. La película de la que te hablé ya no está en el cine. And I definitely have to use a compound form if I'm introducing, or if the antecedent is a thing, and I'm using a preposition longer than one syllable. La película sobre la que hablamos, o sobre la cual hablamos, ya no está en el cine. La película acerca de la cual, o acerca de la que hablamos, ya no está en el cine. Keep in mind again what I talked about in the initial video, that if you have these compound prepositions like acerca de, the el cual or la cual type of form tends to sound a little bit better and be used more frequently. So again, on the second group here, la escuela a que asistí de niño fue demolida, right? I can just use que because this antecedent thing, right, is being followed by, in other words, our relative clause is being introduced by a one-syllable preposition. Or I could use a compound form even with that preposition. La escuela a la que asistí de niño fue demolida, or la escuela a la cual asistí de niño fue demolida. In each of the cases, in both sets of examples, I've sort of on purpose arranged them to sort of flow down to what I think is the best sounding form. Okay, now having introduced that rule with its two sort of contingencies, its two exceptions, I'd like to propose an even simpler rule that I think also covers all cases. We might call this the, quote, use que unless there's a preposition rule, unquote. And it goes like this. When introducing a relative clause, you can always begin with the relative pronoun que unless a preposition is involved. And then, if your antecedent is a thing, use a compound form from the el que or el cual groups. Or, if your antecedent is a person, use quien or quienes. So essentially, this just simplifies what we saw on the last couple of slides. And on this slide, all I've done was represent the rule I just explained graphically for you visual learners out there, right? So you can always use que when beginning a relative clause unless there's a preposition, unless it's preceded by any kind of preposition, such as the ones in the little circle, right? Por, sobre, quien, para, acerca de, etc. Then, if the antecedent's a thing, use one of the el cual or el que grouping relative pronouns. And if the antecedent was a person or persons, use quien or quienes. So let's go ahead and test this configuration, this rule, by completing some fill-in-the-blank relative pronoun exercises, as if we're taking a quiz in your Spanish class, right? So I've put together 5 groupings of slides. On the first slide, you're going to see a fill-in-the-blank exercise or example, and then right after I have you think about your answers, I'll switch to a slide that has the answers for that group, okay? All right, so here we have exercises or examples 1 through 4. And as we go through these, or as you go through these, remember, all we care about is whether we need a preposition, whether we see a preposition in this case. If not, we're using que no matter what. We don't even have to think about it. So that gives you a hint about this particular group. Take a second, maybe write down your answers for numbers 1 through 4, and then I'll show you my correct answers. Go ahead and pause this if you need to here. Okay, on to the answers then. This is the way they should be completed. Since we don't have any prepositions and we're dealing with things, regardless if it's things or people, if there's no prepositions, remember the rule we're talking about dictates that they have to be que. Vamos a ver la película que Juan nos recomendó. ¿Lavaste la ropa que te pusiste ayer? Ese es el coche que quiero comprar. Reservemos el vuelo que sale de Lima a las 7. Okay, let's move on to our second set of fill-in-the-blank examples or exercises. I'll just point out a couple things by way of hints. The antecedents are things, not persons. And we don't have any prepositions introducing the relative clause. And really, that's the key thing. It doesn't matter. We could throw some people in here, but we don't have prepositions, and so that's going to dictate what our best possibility is going to be in these cases. Take a second, write down your answers, pause if you need to here, and I'll give you the answers on the next slide. Okay, so here's how I completed these examples or exercises. Obviously, I inserted the relative pronoun que for the reason I just explained. We don't have a preposition. So, even though we have the comma, the non-restrictive clause that we talked about in the previous lesson, la reunión, que va a ser muy aburrida, empieza en 5 minutos. O la novela, que tenía 320 páginas, era muy interesante. Su documental, que fue rodado en París, estrenó en Nueva York. Pasamos la tarde en una playa remota, que era muy hermosa. Now, I'm not saying que is the only answer that works here. I could say la novela, la cual tenía, or su documental, el que o el cual fue rodado en París. What I'm teaching you in this lesson is that you only have to use que, so it reduces your options. All right, moving on to the, let's see, is this our third set of examples and answers? Again, same format. Figure out how you would fill in the blanks, and in a second I'll give you the answers on the next slide. What I might point out is we're still dealing with things rather than persons, but if you look closely on this slide, you might see some prepositions. So take a second, write down your answers, and pause the video when you're ready to move on and see the answers. Go ahead and hit play. Okay, so here are the answers on this slide. Notice that you should be using the compound, or what I sometimes call the long forms. In other words, we shouldn't use que necessarily, okay? Although after the short preposition en, we could. So example number 9, cerraron aquel restaurante en el que o en el cual te conocí. Technically, I could just say que because it's following that one syllable preposition. But I like el que or el cual te conocí, which coincides with the rule we're teaching in the second half of this video. ¿Dónde queda la biblioteca en la que estudias o en la cual estudias? Esas son las películas acerca de las cuales o las que nos habló el profesor. ¿Qué pasó con la casa al lado de la cual o al lado de la que vivimos tantos años? Again, the part of the rule we're dealing with here is things, the antecedents, things, but there's a preposition. That's the key thing. There's a preposition, the antecedent are things, and so we have to use, or we can use the pronoun, excuse me, I'm tripping over my words, a pronoun from the el que or el cual groupings. Okay, here we have our fourth grouping of exercises or examples, fill in the blank exercises. And of course now I've given you some examples where the antecedent is people or persons. But again, that doesn't matter because if you don't see a preposition, or it doesn't matter much, as long as you don't see a preposition, the best answer, or at least the answer you can go with, is que. So write down your answers, pause the video, and hit play when you're ready to see the correct answers. All right, here are those correct answers. As I sort of intimated a few seconds ago, even though we're dealing with people, the fact that we don't have a preposition, right? We don't have a preposition here means that the best answer to fill in these blanks is the relative pronoun que, right? Ahí está el hombre que me dio la información. Necesito escribirle al profesor que me asignó la tarea. ¿Hablaste con la mujer que conocimos anoche? Mi madre, que siempre dice la verdad, prometió llevarme a España. Mi hermana, que vivía en Portland, se mudó a Seattle. Finally, ese estudiante que estudia mucho Sacó muy buenas notas. In numbers 13 through 15, you have to use que. Numbers 16 through 18, you can use que. All right, and finally, and if you're getting good at predicting things, you probably know that on this slide, we're going to be looking at antecedents who are persons, people or persons, right? But you're also going to have a relative clause preceded by a preposition. See if you can remember the rule. Go ahead and pause the video, write down your answers, and hit play when you're ready to see my correct answers. Okay, so again, here our antecedents are people, but first we're looking for the preposition. If we see the prepositions such as con, de, contra, al lado de, acerca de, and our antecedents a person, we're going to use quien or quienes. Not that that's the only option, but it works, and it's easier to remember just que or quienes. So, number 19. Javier es el gerente con quien trabajé ayer. Ahí va la chica de quien hablamos ayer. Él es el candidato contra quien luchamos. Or, Enrique es el candidato al lado de quien lucharemos. Ana es la novia con quien siempre soñaba. Ella es la mujer al lado de quien quiero pasar el resto de mi vida. No conocía a los colegas con quienes trabajé la semana pasada. Aprendí bastante de los colegas junto a quienes trabajé. Again, these aren't necessarily the only answers you might be able to use if you reviewed the previous part of the video, the previous lesson. A compound form such as aprendí bastante de los colegas junto a los que o a los cuales trabajé. But what I'm trying to illustrate in this video is a reductive approach. We can just use que or quien depending on whether or not there's a preposition and the antecedent is a thing or a person. All right, that concludes my presentation, this shorter, more streamlined presentation, I hope, on relative clauses and relative pronouns in Spanish. Hope you found it to be informative and useful. As always, I welcome your comments, questions, and suggestions. And I hope you'll visit my website at professorjason.com, follow me on Twitter, and like my Facebook page. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you at the next lesson. Hasta pronto. Ciao.